Hi guys, so this week I want to talk about self-identity. I didn't actually start with the intention to talk about self-identity, but what I initially wanted to talk about was the concept that you may not be unhappy because you feel you're overweight. It might be that you're overweight because you're unhappy. So I spoke about this with my wife, and she looked at me and she said, but I'm not unhappy. At which point I said, you're not overweight. And then it dawned on me, this whole thing comes down to self-identity, how you identify yourself. And in my wife's case, she's put weight on, she's lost weight, just like everybody else. But she continues to identify as being overweight. So I did a lot of reading on it and a lot of exploring around this topic, and it got me thinking about some experiences I'd had growing up. And I'd like to share them with you because I feel that it will be helpful to explain the whole self-identity and its importance when it comes to goal setting. So i.e. you want to lose weight, you want to run a marathon, you want to give up smoking, whatever it is. My journey with self-identity comes down to three things, I believe. How I perceive myself in the wider world, how my home life was, and how my school life was. And this is all how my early thoughts of my own self-identity formed my outlook when I was very young. In the wider world and how I perceive myself, I believe it had a lot to do with the fact that it might not have escaped you, but I'm a mixed race person. My mum is white, my dad is black. And during the 80s, where I was born in 1980, so during the 80s and 90s, being in a mixed race relationship and being mixed race was tricky. It wasn't met with the same acceptance that it is now. For example, I can think of two things that happened to me and my mother very early on in my life. We were in a post office, I was very young, I was in a pushchair. We were standing in a queue and a chap spat at my mum and said she was disgusting. We were disgusting for being in a mixed race relationship. And for me being mixed race. Another incident, that actually happened by the way, unbelievable isn't it? Another incident is it was suggested to my mum that I wasn't welcome at Cubs when I was young and that some of the other parents didn't feel it was appropriate. And it was strongly implied it was because I was mixed race. Now, let's put all that aside for a moment, because we live in different times and things have somewhat evolved since then. Now you look at my home life. Now I've spoken in previous videos before about how I had a very unsupportive and self-esteem destroying father. What I hadn't mentioned is something that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable to say, but for the sake of this video, I'll say it. He was also very aggressive and extremely violent. And what that meant was, in our house, that we lived in fear. I lived in fear. My mum lived in fear. My sister, my brothers, they lived in fear. So when you've had a rubbish day, you're not feeling accepted in the big wide world, you're having a hard time at school, most people get to come home and they get the comforts at home. We didn't have that. We came home to just fear and further ridicule of who we were. So then I go to school, right? And it turns out I'm not very good academically and I was never considered an athlete at all. So that obviously had a big impact on my confidence and made it very difficult for me to make friends. See, now I later find out that I have severe dyslexia, and even though I have severe dyslexia, I was taught how to handle that, how to cope with that, and how to use it in some ways to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And I managed to get myself a degree. So, that's cool, right? That's a happy ending in that sense. And as for not being an athlete, I offer no explanation for that at all. I don't know why that is, but I wasn't much of an athlete. So if you take them three things anyway, you've got how I fit in the wider world. There were times in my life where I didn't feel accepted by white people, and there was times in my life where I didn't feel accepted by black people. So you end up feeling a bit of an outcast. So I felt somewhat of an outcast in the wider world. I go home and I'm subjected to fear and violence. I go to school, I'm useless at school. So all these things feed in to how I feel about myself and my self-identity. Now, if you believe you're worthless, you will act like you're worthless. And I never tried because I never thought I could do anything. So when I became 16 years old, all of these things changed. I can't say they changed on purpose, it was just the way things turned out. Cultures changed, people's perception of being mixed race changed around about the mid-90s, and the whole sort of society was becoming more accepting, not just of mixed race, but of other races in general. So that changed, which made me feel slightly more accepted in the world, and some of the anger and prejudice that I had experienced occasionally in my life had sort of dissipated and started to become a lot less. Also, I moved out of my family home and I was living on my own, which meant I no longer lived in fear, and I didn't have that negativity around me of my father all the time. And then lastly, obviously, I left school because I was 16 years old, so I wasn't subjected to feeling useless every day when I was at school. So these three large components that formed my negative self-esteem were removed. Now, I've come to call it negative nourishment. I was being negatively nourished by my life all the time. So constantly then feelings of feeling hopeless and not really feeling worthy of anything were being constantly reaffirmed all the time by my wider world, my home life and my schooling. But finally, at 16, I was at a point where I had the opportunity to discover who I am, not who I've been told or made to think I am. And at the same time, I started wrestling. I started weight training due to wrestling. And I started to feel actually quite good at wrestling and weight training and quite enjoyed it. Started to form, a bit of self-identity. At the same time, started to get a bit of interest for the opposite sex. That doesn't hurt either. So that was also a bonus. But that doesn't mean that even though things were changing and that all the negative nourishment had gone away, that the work was done towards me creating a more positive self-identity. Every morning when I wake up, I have something that I've come to call dad default. The way my dad made me feel was constantly reaffirmed every morning. Really, you're useless, every single morning. And every morning, even though he's not here, I still feel it. And I have to tell myself every single time I get stressed or I'm tired or I'm hungry, whichever, I have to always tell myself that I'm not that person. So the thing there is, the work towards your self-identity never stops. It's not something that's fixed, it's something that changes as your life evolves, as you might earn more money at work or your job responsibilities change or you have children. This self-identity is constantly evolving and flowing all the time. Self-talk is very important to the way you talk to yourself, the way you treat yourself is very important. People like to classify their identities, why do you smoke? I'm a smoker, so I smoke. I'm a drinker, so I drink. I'm a foodie, so I eat. But, some of those things can be considered negative. Some people say, okay, smoking or drinking in excess is bad for you. But it also works. So when you say yourself you're a smoker or a drinker, then, that could be perceived as a negative thing. But it also works both ways. If you I've had mates before, no matter what they've done the night before, they always get up early and they go for their run. And if you ask them why, they say they're a runner, so they run. There you go. And it works both ways. That could be perceived as a positive thing. That person getting up and going running and looking after themselves and all those sorts of things. Same with people that have really hard manual jobs and they still manage to get to the gym at the end of the day. And you say to them, "How do you do it?" And they say, "Oh, I'm a gym goer. I go to the gym." And people that eat healthy, they're healthy eaters. So they eat healthily. It's what you tell yourself in them testing moments that really defines your self-identity. James Clear wrote a book called Atomic Habits, which I thoroughly recommend. Absolutely a big game changer for me, that book. And he talks about how if you identify yourself as a smoker and you want to give up, and you're offered a cigarette, and you've got two ways of responding to this. You can either say, no thank you, I'm trying to give up, which means that you're still identifying yourself as a smoker. Or you can say, no thank you, I don't smoke. Now you're identifying yourself as a non-smoker. So it's very important that you identify yourself in the right way to yourself and to others, because most people will follow lead. If you're a confident person or you give that sort of aura of confidence, people will accept that in most cases. So it's very important how you define yourself as a person, because you are in control of that. Whether you feel like you are or not, you are in control of that. At the end of the day, it's not up to you to satisfy other people's perception of what's good to look at. You are not an ornament. You're a human being. You're a person. My son said something to me on a dog walk the other day that was extremely profound for a 10-year-old. He says to me, Dad, why are all trees so different, but all so beautiful? I know, right? If you want to learn something about life, speak to a kid, because they tell it to you in plain talk, that's for sure. But I mean, in closing, what I'm getting at is, in order to really change your self-identity and then in turn have the confidence and the ability to be able to achieve your goals that you want to achieve, whatever they are, you have to remove the negative nourishment from your life. You have to decide who you want to be, and you have to take as many steps as you can every day towards becoming that person, because one day you will be that person. But you have to understand one thing. The work towards your self-identity will never stop. It's constant. As your life changes, you have to change with it. That's my message. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.